Let me get away from the full screen so I can actually see what time it is. Oh, 10:25. All right, how is everyone on this glorious
Fine.
day? I'm surprised you're not all out windsurfing or
That's the right trail.
you know, what other kinds of water skiing?
Not that warm.
I
Not yet.
know Bruce is a big Bruce.
Yeah.
Bruce must be a big water skier.
Oh, well, you got half of that right.
The skier part or the water part?
The big.
It's okay.
Yeah, but not as big as before the pandemic.
It's really amazing, you know, that this thing is really going to go away.
I'm so excited that we'll be able to see some of our friends. I have
John,
my second shot today, so in 2 weeks I can see people.
Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Mazel tov.
I have my second on this coming Monday.
Okay. Has everybody had a first? Who hasn't had a first? Everybody's had a first shot? Hal, you haven't had a shot yet?
Not it.
Has everybody got a first?
Oh, you had both. You're on mute.
Second was yesterday.
We'll give it another couple of
How did people?
another couple of minutes. Good morning, Helen.
Hi, good morning.
Lee, good morning.
Morning.
Barbara.
Hi, I haven't gotten my shot and I don't see I'm anywhere near getting it. I'm just like on a list and I don't hear from them and it just goes on and on. I don't know how do people.
Well, evidently now Safeway and several of the pharmacies. Costco has.
Yep.
So
Walmart
Costco's.
does.
Call these. Either get online or call these places and you'll get a shot.
You have to go like online first to Costco or online first to Safeway
Yeah.
and then do
So
it.
to register.
Turn it just a little bit so I could be seen too.
Yeah, and try and get through. The other way to do this is how we did it, and that is to have a son or a child who
Can you see the picture?
who takes it as a mission to get us to. Our Misha was pressured by his sister
Maybe that one too.
to get shots, and he actually got a reservation. So don't give up, Barbara. Okay, I have 10:29.
There was an article in the Oregonian yesterday about a group of people who are helping seniors who can't get in, helping them get reservations. It was
Is that local?
local.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
It was a lawyer and she's Jewish, but I can't remember her name.
No, her name was Roggaway, and I wondered how she was related to Roggaways. Does anyone know?
That's your daughter.
Anyway, absolutely, you should look up the front page of the Oregonian.
Yesterday it was, I think.
Yes.
Okay. Good morning.
Good morning.
So I suspect unless you've allowed yourself to be confronted by a Christian missionary, you have never encountered Isaiah 52 and 53. It's not part of our liturgy. It's there. It's one of the sections of Isaiah, but it's not one. It doesn't come up in a haftarah. It doesn't come up in other readings. So and it's a difficult passage. However, what does it contain? It contains, in many ways, this passage, the most central, it becomes the proof text for the most central ideas. The suffering, death, and resurrection of Jesus is proved in this passage.
I don't know. There's probably
Now, you may have had difficulty with how our authors present it, but that's it. But before we get there, I want to do something else, which I want you to be awestruck. So let me first of all get rid of this gallery view. No, not getting. Get rid of the full screen so that I have and okay, I'm still not so good at this. All right, can you see that?
Yes.
How many of you have been to the Israel Museum in Jerusalem and been in the, I don't remember what the building is called, but it's the top of it is the shape of one of the canisters that was at the Dead Sea. So this is, as you see at the top, it says the Israel Museum, Jerusalem, the Great Isaiah Scroll. Now, this is not necessarily Isaiah 53. However, this is the dead. Some claim that the Dead Sea finding, you know, was found. I think in 1947, a young shepherd. Arab shepherd was wandering and throwing rocks, and he threw rocks in a cave, and he heard a tinkle like it hit something that was hollow, and he went exploring, and here he found in this cave in Qumran, which is right near the Dead Sea, he found parchments. He had no idea what they were. They weren't written in Arabic, and I don't know whether he was literate himself to begin with. And he brought them to the old city. Again, this is 1947. Brought them to the old city, and he sold them. The claim is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are the greatest find of the 20th century. Now, that may be a little. So I want you to see. So now let me show you. I have a few other things here to show you.
Oh, yeah. So-
Screen share.
By the way, it's called the Shrine of the Book, Hechal HaSefer.
Yes, Shrine of the Book. Thank you. And I've heard all kinds of things that. So here's a close-up, so you can see what it looks like. This is modern Hebrew letters. You know, at a certain point, the lettering in Hebrew switched to what's called the Assyrian script. But here, although it's not clear, you can see that, right?
Yeah.
But this is a close-up of what some of the and you can make out certain letters, right? You can make out there are a lot of lameds here, which are okay. So I think that's very impressive. Now let me impress you some more.
I just can't get comfortable.
Yeah.
I have physical therapy.
All right, 1, 2. So
That's interesting.
come on.
Does the computer answer when he
Did
says
you
that?
notice that the mem at the end is not a mem safeh that we're used to?
Oh, I didn't realize that. I can go
Yeah.
back. So here's a description. The Great Isaiah Scroll is one of the original 7 Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in Qumran in 1947. It is the largest, 700, right? It's 2.5 inches to 2.5 centimeters to an inch.
2.54.
So we're talking about 300 inches. Approximately, we're talking about 20 feet. So it's a long parchment. And best preserved. You could see that was not so terrifically preserved, but it's the best preserved of all the biblical scrolls, and the only one that is almost complete. The 54 columns contain all 64 chapters of the Hebrew version, the biblical book of Isaiah. Now remember, we talked about the fact that there's first Isaiah, there's Deutero Isaiah, and then there's probably third Isaiah. People who lived at different times. Already in this manuscript, these three individuals are already combined into one text, dating from 125 BCE. It is also one of the oldest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some 1,000 years older than the oldest manuscript of the Hebrew Bible known to us before the scroll's discovery. So here you have Isaiah. First Isaiah is in the 8th century BCE, 740 BCE. This text is from 125 BCE. So we have 600 years from the time of first Isaiah until this manuscript. 600 years. And now, and this manuscript, this is why this was one of the greatest discoveries, because this text that we have here is 1,000 years older than the earliest biblical manuscript that we have. Are you impressed? Please be impressed. So, we don't have, in other words, we don't have any, the Aleppo Codex is maybe from the 8th to the 9th century, maybe the 10th century. I have to look it up. But some of these oldest texts that we have of the Bible are from 1,000 years ago. But we're talking about Isaiah, who lived 2,700 years ago, and this is now a text. So what a great find, because no one had any idea how accurate any of these biblical books were, because what happens over 1,700 years.
They disintegrate.
The version of the text is generally in agreement with the Masoretic or traditional version. That's pretty amazing. Codified in medieval codices, such as the Aleppo Codex. It's one of the oldest that we have. But it contains many variant readings, alternative spellings, scribal errors, and corrections. In other words, still at this time, the text was undergoing changes. Unlike most of the biblical scrolls from Qumran, it exhibits a very full orthography, spelling. Spelling was not standardized. Understand that there were no vowels. The vowels that we use today in Hebrew are from the 9th century CE. So sometimes, in order to deal with the spelling, there is what in Hebrew is called Ketiv Malay, to give you an idea of what the vowels are, revealing how Hebrew was pronounced in the Second Temple period. Around 20 additional copies of the book of Isaiah were also found at Qumran. One more copy was discovered further south, as well as 6 psharim, commentaries based on the book. Isaiah is also frequently quoted in other scrolls. A literary and religious phenomenon also present in New Testament writings, but there's no New Testament writing that was found at Qumran. The authoritative and scribal status of the book of Isaiah is consistent with the messianic beliefs of the community living in Qumran. We don't know a lot about that community that lived there. Since Isaiah is known for his prophecies of judgment and consolation and his visions of the end of days and the coming of the kingdom of God. Modern scholarship considers the book of Isaiah to be an anthology. This we already know. The two principal compositors, principal compositions of which are the book of Isaiah proper, chapters 1 to 39, with some exceptions, containing the words of the prophet Isaiah himself, dating from the time of the first temple. First temple is from the time of Solomon until, which is 1000 BCE, till the Babylonian exile, which was 586. So around 700 BCE. And second Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, chapters 40 to 66, which is of our interest today, comprising the words of an anonymous prophet who lived some 150 years later, around the time of the Babylonian exile. That's who we're interested in, and the restoration of the temple in the Persian period. By the time our Isaiah scroll was copied, the last third of the 2nd century BCE, the book was already regarded as a single composition. That's pretty. Are you amazed? Be amazed. I have one other piece that I want to share with you here. 1 second. How do we get to it? It's this one here. Okay, let me now bring this up. I'm getting better at this, even so it's still slow. The text of the great Isaiah scroll, that's that whole thing, all 66 chapters, which they say comes from 125 BCE. 125 BCE was really shortly after the Maccabees. The text of the great Isaiah scroll generally conforms to the Masoretic traditional versions. At the same time, however, the 2,000-year-old scroll contains alternative spellings, scribal errors, corrections, and most fundamentally, many variant readings. Strictly speaking, the number of textual variants is well over 2,600. What I mean by a variant is, a minor difference, ranging from a single letter, sometimes one or more words, to complete variant verse or verses. For example, I think the example is interesting. The second half of verse 9 and all of verse 10 in the present Masoretic version of chapter 2 are absent in the great Isaiah scroll in the Israel Museum's full manuscript that you see here online. The same verses, however, have been included in other versions of the book of Isaiah in the scrolls found near the Dead Sea. And the Hebrew text from which the ancient Greek version or Septuagint was translated. So in this big scroll, you have sentences that are missing, but there are other scrolls, ancient scrolls, in which the sentences are there. This confirms that these verses, although early enough, were a late addition to the ancient and more original version reflected in the great Isaiah scroll. So in 125 BCE, they were still amending the text. They were still changing. So the standard text that we have today went through many emendations. Okay, so much for show and tell. I have one more show and tell, but we'll get to that a little later. So now I can see you all. So this whole concept of the suffering servant. In the chapter, they write that the term suffering servant, which is a term you've probably heard, is a reference only to Isaiah, and it was coined. The term was not coined until 1892 by a German Lutheran scholar. It's interesting that the word for servant in the text is the word eved. Now, we're all familiar with the fact that eved not only means servant, it also means slave. So when, for instance, in the text in the Torah refers to Moses as Eved Adonai, are we talking about the slave of God or the servant of God? However, in the Haggadah, when we sing Avadim Hayinu, right, we're not talking about servants, we're really talking about slaves. Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Interesting that this becomes theologically such an important text for Christians, and for Jews, we're not aware of it. So when I've had this experience more than once, when an evangelical comes and wants to prove that the messiahship of Jesus, they will bring this text. They will bring Isaiah 52 and 53 to prove that in fact what Isaiah is talking about is predicting Jesus. Again, second Isaiah is from around the year during the Babylonian exile. So sometime the second Isaiah was written sometime between 597 and 530. I mean, think of the craziness. We Jews do the same thing. That here was a text from around 600 BCE. And now it's being used to prove something that took place in the first century. To take this text and prove it. What is it proving? So we're going to look at the whole text in a minute, but the most important line is 53:5. 53:5 says the following. Now understand different translations. These words and these sentences are complex. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we were healed. Well, if you're a Christian,
that's Jesus.
How can it be anybody else, right? Isaiah, right? Let me read it again. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Let me just read you our translation, our JPS translation for that verse, and is not too much different. But he was wounded because of our sins, crushed because of our iniquities. He bore the chastisements that made us whole, and by his bruises we were healed. A little different. First of all, it doesn't talk about being pierced. That, of course, is an important word because Jesus was pierced on the cross. So that verse becomes very central. What else do we learn from this text is that the Jews rejected Jesus and the Gentiles accepted him. That's a very important concept too. Why did the Jews not accept? Why didn't Judaism all of a sudden become the new Christianity? Why did somehow Judaism split into those that accepted Jesus from those who rejected Jesus, and that the Jews remained apart? Also from this passage, central is that Jesus' suffering is a paradigm to be followed. So the line is, he committed no sin and no deceit was found in his mouth. He entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. So there's, an acceptance of silent suffering. This is a theme that runs through the New Testament: silent suffering and accepting your fate, which is something that was it in the 70s or the 80s, South American Christian theologians rejected that idea, and they came up with, anybody remember, they came up with what was called liberation theology. Liberation theology was no, the religious point of view is to fight against oppression, and as a matter of fact, liberation theology took most of its ideas from the book of Exodus. What is liberation theology? It is overthrowing the ruling power and liberating yourself. What is that story? That story is the Exodus. So here you have a very different idea. One is an acceptance of one's fate.
Well, Rabbi,
Yeah.
Jesus supposedly says on the cross, "God, why have you forsaken me?"
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, that is a quotation from Psalms, but you're about 3 weeks ahead of time, because that line is one of the later chapters. Yes, but he committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. He entrusted himself to one who judges justly. Now, where do we have the opposite idea of this? It seems to me the opposite idea of accepting your fate is in Job. Because what is Job really all about? Job suffers. His friends his 3 friends who come to visit him tell him that when you suffer, your suffering is justified, and therefore you have to examine your ways and your deeds to explain why you're suffering. And Job says, "No, I do not deserve this. This is wrong." And so, in fact, the book of Job is a rejection, a very strong rejection of that idea that one should accept one's fate. And the last thing that is focused on in this section of the suffering servant, by the way, there are four pieces to the suffering servant. This is the longest one. It predicts Jesus' arrest, and that his suffering, his death, and we're going to see how they prove his resurrection as well. By the way, the idea of a suffering servant is found only in the book of Isaiah. Nowhere else do we have this idea of of suffering which is to be accepted, and it really fits with when Isaiah lives, because he lives during the time of the Babylonian exile, and where people are wondering, why are we suffering like this? We don't deserve this. Even so many of the other prophets, central part of their prophecy is this is punishment, a deserved punishment. All right, let me see. So let's go ahead and look at the text. I left off the last few verses here. I'm going to show you how we can do this. We want to read the text. Get rid of full screen. I'm going to go here. So rather than taking the Jewish text, we want to look at the at a Christian version of this text. Screen share. Okay. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. So leaving off the last lines of chapter 52, and let's just look at the. I'm gonna make it bigger
Thank you.
so that you can read it, so that we can all read it. Okay. Now I have to move this here. Okay, and move this here. So, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Okay, so how can you interpret that? Simply that line?
No, Rabbi, is this still the Dead Sea Scroll text?
No.
I mean, this is a translation of the Hebrew. The Hebrew, as they said, the Hebrew is in many ways incomprehensible, but best we can do. So think about this: who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? I think this is the Jews were got the message, but they didn't believe it. Right? The Jews rejected the message of Jesus. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So now he grew up. He grew up before him like a tender shoot.
I had it all taken care of, and you just messed
And like a root of out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him. Nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. This is still, Isaiah speaking to the as far as the interpretation that this is Jesus. That we didn't find him anything special. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. We didn't accept who he was. Remember, this is Isaiah speaking in the 6th century BCE. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Wow, right? That sounds like Jesus. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. Okay, so he bore our suffering, but we didn't buy it. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Okay, that very central line, verse 6. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord was laid on him the iniquity of us all. It's still the same idea. We didn't understand, we didn't accept the truth. Right? This is from a Christian understanding of this text. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so that he did not open his mouth. This whole idea of God, of Jesus as the lamb. We had that with Passover, and here it is again. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who in his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people, he was punished. Okay, he suffered for, as far as Christians are concerned, for our sins. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. What is this business of the wicked and the rich? Well, by tradition, Jesus was buried in the grave of a rich man. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him. Can I bring this down? Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Now, what's going on here? This is the verse. We had now suffering. It appears we have death. And what's the last thing we need?
Resurrection.
Resurrection, right? So how do we have resurrection? Because here it says, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. Well, if he died and now he sees his offspring, that must be resurrection. Now, what do Jews do with that? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many. What's the last part here? I can't read what it says, but I couldn't take a picture of the whole thing. So that line 11, after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many and will hear their iniquities. It's not there. I'm going to read you the last line, verse 12. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. He will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressions. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors.
That's it.
Yeah, that's the end of this section.
Well, that's pretty convincing, isn't it?
Elaine is gonna convert. What a Shanda, president of the synagogue who converts. So it is pretty convincing. If you start out with that belief. So this idea that one can take a very old text, take a current event or a more recent event and say, this is what he meant 700 years ago. It's really a kind of audacious thing to do. Let me take this away. Then we'll come back to all of us. It's really a kind of audacious thing to say, here it is. Isaiah anticipated this 600 years ago. So what do Jews do with this text? First of all, the text is very difficult. The translation is difficult, and I could have given you, what I gave you was a Christian translation. I could have given you the Jewish translation. So most commentators, most Jewish traditions say what Isaiah is referring to is a composite. This, when he refers to an individual, he is referring to the Jewish people. The Jewish people who, all of Israel that suffers, and suffers where there is no reason for their suffering, but we live with it. We endure it, so the servant is Israel, punished in exile, and to be restored eventually to the land. That's how Rashi sees it, and so Ibn Ezra, a medieval commentator, says it's not possible that it refers to their God, because a dead person cannot see his offspring. And we saw that line about the offspring. There's, by the way, nowhere else in the Bible that talks about either resurrection or an afterlife. There's only one passage, and that is a very famous passage of Ezekiel 37. People familiar with when I say Ezekiel 37, what I'm referring to? You ever heard, you know the Negro spiritual, the hip bones connected to the thigh bone, and the thigh bones connected to the bone. Where's that from? What's that?
Donnie said, "Hachazon ha'atzamot hayaveshot."
Yes,
Donnie.
yeah, the vision of the dry bones. Right, that Ezekiel has a vision in chapter 37. It's a really wonderful passage. The Hebrew is actually very quite simple. Ezekiel has a vision. Remember, Ezekiel lives at the same time as Isaiah, as second Isaiah. And this is his vision. He sees a valley filled with dry bones, dead. And slowly but surely, those dry bones come together and they form a human being, or they form many human beings. And once they not only have bones, but sinew and tissue and skin come on the bones, and then God blows life into those bones. Well, even Jewish tradition understood that vision as a vision about resurrection. But that's not what Ezekiel had in mind. What was Ezekiel talking about? This was Ezekiel talking to a devastated generation in exile. And they are in exile like dry bones. They are dead. And Ezekiel is giving them hope and promise for the future. Those dry bones will live. They will come together. This is not the end. This is, we have a continuity. Without visions like Ezekiel's and others, it's hard for me to imagine the Jews would have survived. That was really their mission, to say to these people, because understand, as far as we know, when one people conquered another people, the first thing they did when a major empire conquered the first thing they did was destroy their temple. Because in destroying their temple, they were defeating their God. And when your God is defeated, it means their God is stronger than your God. And almost in every case, people started to worship the God of the victor. Only the Jews survived the destruction of their temple. And they survived the destruction of their temple, unlike every other people, because they had a different theology. That there were not gods of every nation, but there was one God of the universe. And the reason that they were punished, the reason that they were defeated, was because they were deserving of punishment. And if they repented, God would relent of his punishment and allow them to return. And it's because of that theology that Jews survived. That Ezekiel is promising that no, it's not. You don't go and assimilate into the victorious party. What you do is you hold on to your ideals, and eventually you will survive. Now, according to tradition, that Babylonian exile was 70 years. Historically, we know that it was less than that. It was probably 50 years. If that exile had taken much longer, Jews probably wouldn't have survived. So with an exile of about 50 years, children who were part of the exile probably came back as senior citizens. If the exile is too much longer, Jews might not have been able to withstand, been able to survive in the diaspora for without seeing something else. So it's only that passage in Ezekiel in 37 that later on was interpreted to be resurrection. But nowhere in the Torah is there discussion about resurrection.
Rabbi?
Yep.
If the Jews could not have survived more than 2 generations of exile at that time, what was the difference when we were exiled in 70 AD? What made the difference that allowed us to survive 2,000 years of diaspora or 2,000 years of exile?
Anybody want to take a stab at that? I mean, that's a great question.
Well, that was when the Jewish center, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and they moved to Beit Sha'arim, and they set up everything in the Galil, and they took all of the laws and with them, and they set up the Sanhedrin was reestablished in a new place. So they said, we don't need the temple and we don't need the sacrifices. Instead, we will have this. And then they became, it went all into the Galilee, and that's why we have Tzipori and Beit Sha'arim and all of the places where the Sanhedrin still made laws and judged and did everything.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I would have put it attributed to Yochanan ben Zakkai and the creation of Yavne as the Judaism was centered in the temple and sacrifice. And somehow, we don't exactly know when, was it in the diaspora? Exactly. Jews created now synagogues. You didn't need to go to bring your sacrifices to the temple. We developed a whole mechanism for survival away from our center. It's a kind of miraculous. People will remember what was the name of the book? When the Dalai Lama invited 5 Jews to come to Dar es Salaam to explore with him, to explain to him how it is that Jews survived for 2,000 years separated from their land. Because that was exactly the issue that the Dalai Lama was dealing with. He was now in India, not in Tibet, not in China. How were his people going to survive? And who were the experts surviving not in their own land? The Jews. And each of these 5 very interesting characters that went to the Dalai Lama had a different answer. In terms of how Jews survived, because how does a people survive not in their land? I mean, think about it for a minute. Give you an outrageous situation. Imagine if, for whatever reason, we as Americans had to abandon America. I should take a different example because America is so big, but we had to, because of, who knows, nuclear explosion, whatever, we had to abandon, and we spread out all over the world. And we created little pockets in different places of Americans, expats. How long would we survive as Americans? Maybe a generation. You know, maybe we pass it on to our children. Maybe pass it on to our grandchildren. But at a certain point, they no longer speak English. They no longer know. There aren't the institutions to teach the major American texts, to teach our culture as Americans, so that being in the land is a really important aspect of national cultural survival. We Jews did it, but I think I think earlier at the time of the destruction of the temple, they didn't have the equipment to survive that long. Right? What is the quotation? Al Naharot Bavel, on the rivers of Babylon. Sham yashavnu gam bachinu. There we sat, there we cried. Bizochrenu et Zion, remembering Zion, right? So it's the synagogue. It is our continuing to have this connection to this land that we didn't live in. It was an idea that allowed for our survival. But we probably didn't have that equipment earlier on. But I think it's a very good question. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that thought.
So is the land of Israel central to that idea today?
Well,
No.
could Judaism survive into the future without the state of Israel?
Yes.
I don't know. I kind of doubt it.
No.
We survived for 2,000 years, from the time of of Yochanan ben Zakkai, from the destruction of the temple, until the beginnings of Zionism, and where the land became an important idea in our prayers, in our L'Shana B'Yerushalayim. But I think the state of Israel is so central. Not that we have to agree with everything they do, God forbid, but is so central. I don't know that we could survive that trauma luckily that's not in the cards. Despite their fourth election in 2 weeks, within 2 years, I'm not sure we have. Anybody agree or disagree with me with how central the current state of Israel is to Jewish survival?
I definitely agree, Rabbi.
But what about the communities in India, in Rome, in Africa?
Yep.
It's an open question.
But these communities survive somehow with a connection to Israel. Whether they visit or they don't visit. I don't know what percentage of American Jews have visited Israel, but even those who've never visited Israel, Israel nevertheless remains a part of their pride, part of their identity, and I'm not sure that we have the inner strength as a people to survive without the land. Remember, demographically, in broad numbers, 40% of the Jewish people live in the United States. A little bit more than 40% of the Jewish people live in Israel. So we have something like 18% of the Jewish people live in different places. Where's the third largest Jewish community? France.
I was just going to say that. Yeah.
As the third largest Jewish community, 600,000 Jews.
But if Israel continues in its, I don't want to say it's far right, or at least almost undemocratic dealings with other Jews, and what we can do, what we can't do, I think we can survive. It would be terrible. It would be awful to anticipate, but I think we can.
Well, the divisions that exist within Judaism, whether it's Orthodox and non-Orthodox, whether it is the right-wing development in Israel, where American Jews are moving remain in the opposite direction. I'm not sure that we have, we're still struggling with a lot of those things.
Classical reform tried it.
What's that?
Classical reform from the Pittsburgh platform until after World War II tried Judaism without Israel.
They didn't, right. Actually, the ultra-Orthodox and the Reform were not Zionists. But except for a ridiculous small group of ultra-Orthodox, and that all became Zionists in one way or another. So back to our reading. Does this text and the debate that our authors write, is this text referring to a collective Israel, or is it referring to an individual? And throughout history, there were several people who were suggested. Isaiah himself is talking about himself as a suffering individual, and there were others that were suggested. The very last paragraph of our text on page 303,
right,
reads as follows: Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12 originally referred to one of the prophet's exilic contemporaries. That's whom he viewed as vicariously atoning for the guilt-ridden exilic or post-exilic community. We know neither this individual's name nor anything about him beyond what this difficult passage says. Or perhaps he's a figure imagined by the prophet. Yet given the vividness of this individual and his unusual description, it is easy to see why even the earliest readers of this passage sought to identify the servant. So and so it became very important identification in Christianity, that you read this passage, given a translation that already begins with with what you want it to be at the end, and it clearly it clearly has the thoughts that the theology that becomes central to Christianity. Let me read that. What was that line 5 again? Who was it? Remember line 5. He was pierced for our transgressions, and he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. That the passage has brought a lot of comfort to Christians throughout the centuries. As far as we're concerned, as far as Jewish theology is concerned, we don't know who this individual is or whether it's an individual. Since we as Jews have rejected the other pieces of the theology, we claim this was not fulfilled. This vision was not fulfilled in Jesus, but rather Isaiah was talking about his own troubled time.
Rabbi, was the idea of piercing, which of course is the crucifixion idea, was that even practice in that time?
I don't know. The others who were crucified were not pierced. But remember, in the JPS translation, instead of the word pierced, it says, but he was wounded. I don't have the Hebrew in front of me right now. He was wounded because of our sins, crushed because of our iniquities. He bore the chastisements. So, but Isaiah is struggling with, why are we, as Jews, why are we suffering? We don't deserve this, is basically what he's saying. We as a people do not deserve this. So there has to be some sort of explanation. In the same way that Ezekiel was not talking about resurrection way into the future, even so that's how it was understood in Judaism. He was talking about his own difficult situation. So Isaiah was not talking about a situation hundreds of years into the future. So this passage, I find very interesting that this passage, which is so, in many ways, central to Christian thought,
yes,
Jews are oblivious to it. We don't know about it. And therefore, often when an evangelical comes and wants to prove the legitimacy and divinity of Jesus, they'll present this passage, and most Jews look at it and say, I never saw this before. I don't know what this is. I don't know how to understand it. So next week, you know what passage we're going to look at next week? Something that of which we're very familiar, and that is the theology that comes from the story of Jonah. Jesus and the sign of Jonah is how the so exactly we have to figure out what the sign of Jonah is, but we read Jonah every Yom Kippur afternoon.
yes.
We're familiar with this story. So we'll look at what theology comes directly from the book of Jonah.
Good.
All right.
All right.
Everybody be well. Get outside. Go for a walk. It's gorgeous outside.
A beautiful day.
I went for a walk yesterday. It's the first time. I can see Hal is already ready because I wore my sunglasses for the first time I wore my sunglasses for the first time yesterday. It felt great. I do my walking down by the river, down by the Willamette. I park my car. I walk across the
New Bridge?
Silicon Bridge.
Silicon Crossing?
no, the next one up.
Oh.
The-
Ross Island?
No, that's Ross Island's a little below.
Steel?
Selwood.
No, no, that's the other way.
Hawthorne.
I cross the Hawthorne.
Hawthorne.
I walk on the east side all the way up to the Steel Bridge.
Oh,
I cross the Steel Bridge
what a walk.
and then I walk back down. Yeah, it's almost just about 3 miles,
That's a great idea to do.
but it's a terrific walk. So if you decide to do that walk, I'll probably see you at some point. But I
Did
do it-
Oh,
I do it,
did you wear your mask?
Yes, I do wear my mask. I do wear-
Rabbi,
Yep.
the more I read this book, the less I understand about Christianity, because it sounds, as a Jew, it makes no sense. And the more I read it, it makes less sense. So I don't know if I'm alone in that.
You need to have
So
faith.
if you read it from the opposite point of view,
It's hard to do.
no, right. But if you're a believing Christian and you read this, it becomes so obvious that it's impossible to understand why Jews don't get it.
And the Christians don't understand why Jews don't
Don't
get it.
get it.
So, I mean, I think I shared this with you before. I'm going to Passover, a Passover Seder that was done, not the Seder itself, but an explanation by a Jew for Jesus. And after the gathering, a woman came up to me and she said, "You really should read the New Testament." So I said, "I have." And her next statement was what was so interesting. And she said, "And weren't you convinced?" Now, think about that. In other words, the truth is so self-evident, was so self-evident in her eyes, that simply being exposed to the text would automatically would be automatically convincing. So Trudy, at the same point that you say, "I don't get it," we have 2,000 years beyond us. So, that's why it seems to me that someone who says that I'm a Jew for Jesus, somehow, if you're a Jew for Jesus, you crossed a very important line. You may have been born Jewish, but once you accept the divinity of Jesus and the passages dealing with his suffering, his death, his resurrection, and all the other pieces, you've left Judaism.
The deification of
Right.
You've really left Judaism.
Well, it wasn't just this chapter, the last two, the whole thing with the wine and the cracker, whatever they call it. The Eucharist, and then the virgin birth. And by the time I got to this chapter was, I give up. I don't get it.
Yeah, the issue is not to be convinced. The issue is simply to appreciate where the differences are.
All right.
Where the differences are and how we get to those different places.
Amos alone wrote a book. It must have been I'm trying to remember the name, about 10 years ago now or less, about exactly what happens before the crucifixion, and who is the fellow who betrays him?
Judas.
Judas. Yeah.
Judas.
Well, anyway, Judah, quote, betrays him.
Yep.
And Jesus, this is all in the novel, it's beautiful. And Jesus is then crucified, but he doesn't arise the third day or whatever. And Judah is so upset that he kills himself because his God was not a God.
Oh, my goodness. Well, obviously that was written by a Jew.
Oh, yes. Amos alone wrote it. But
Is it Amos Oz that you're referring to?
Amos Oz, yes.
Amos Oz, who passed away.
Right. I think
number of years
this
ago.
might have been his last novel. But very, very interesting, the way he does it.
So Rabbi, what do you say to a Christian when they say, now that you've read it, are you convinced? Besides, no, I'm not. What else do you say to them?
She was just surprised that she was surprised that I said that I had read the New Testament. It falls into this. I used to receive and haven't received in a long time. I guess they don't have my address. These 4-color magazines from evangelical groups.
Yeah.
And usually somewhere in the middle, there was a story of a kid who late at night under the covers with a flashlight is reading the New Testament. In other words, his Jewish parents prohibited him from being exposed to this literature as somehow dangerous. But that's how he. It's simply why Jews refuse to accept Jesus becomes a really important sore point within Christianity. Why do Jews continue to exist? Jews should have ceased to exist because God's grace was taken away from Israel and given to new Israel, which is the Christian church.
What do they say about the Muslims and the Buddhists?
Yeah, but they come, they are understand themselves as a continuation of the grace that came from God, so Jews should have ceased to exist, and it becomes a really important piece of religious anti-Semitism throughout Europe for a long time.
Maybe Christians should cease to exist.
No. We are.
I have to tell you, Rabbi, we used to get.
Who would pick on us?
We have what are they? Not holy rollers, but we have a church up from us. They used to come down into our neighborhood.
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would come and knock on your door, and the first words out of their mouth were, "Do you believe in Jesus Christ?"
Mm-hmm.
Well, after about the second time of that, I said to this gentleman, I said, "Yeah, he was a really great carpenter, and he did the cabinets in my kitchen." And guess what? They never came back.
That's
but I have a really sore spot in my heart for evangelical Christians because I grew up as an evangelical Christian and converted to Judaism.
Oh my gosh.
And I will tell you, they're nothing more than a bunch of Bible thumping idiots.
No. Come on, Ron. That's
Ron, is it any better than the Chabadniks that came up to me one day and said, "You look Jewish. Have you put on tefillin?" I rolled up my sleeve and I showed him where the marks were, and he was astounded.
Astounded.
Yeah, he was astounded that the random person he picked on, A, knew what tefillin was, and B, not only knew how to use it.
The difference is that, you know, in the Gospel of John, the line is that none may come to the Father but through the Son.
Mhm.
Now, if you accept that, that means that we are, anybody who doesn't accept Jesus is somehow in the dark. And it becomes the job of a Christian to bring people what they call the good news, that this is a compassionate way to be. Now, we're not an evangelical group. We do, you know, we do not actively proselytize. And we don't actively proselytize for a lot of reasons, and probably because over the centuries, in wherever Jews lived, it was dangerous to proselytize. That anybody who converted someone to Judaism, both the individual and whoever the person was that taught that individual, were subject to punishment. That's not the only reason, but you know, so you know, here you have on the front page of the New York Times today, an evangelical, a very well-known evangelical woman, Beth Moore, who was leaving the Southern Baptist Conference. Because of its because of how it's been transformed over the years, in particular during the Trump years. So you know, these things, you know, where people are, what people feel is their mission in life. It becomes very important. What we as Jews want is to be left alone, or to be respected for who we are. And in America, we've achieved that. I think we have achieved that.
Well, I'm sorry.
The fact that people,
having lived in the South,
the fact that people would like you to become a Baptist, or that's one thing. But really, coercive measures in America are illegal.
Yes, but it pervades in the workplace. It can be very difficult.
All right, I've never experienced that, but
Trust me.
I take
You're a rabbi.
In the work.
Yes, in my workplace, I've never experienced that.
Where Elliot worked, at lunchtime, they had Bible groups.
Jesus.
Was he obligated to participate?
Well, as the only Jew in the company, no. But how does that make you feel?
Right.
Are you part of the group, or are you not part of the group?
But should they be prevented from having Bible study?
I don't think it's appropriate in the workplace, even at lunch, but that's my view.
During lunch.
But even where I worked, one of my aides could not understand that I could not believe in Jesus. She said, but you don't practice, you don't do what I do, but you still believe in Jesus? No.
Yep.
No, there's a mindset there that's different.
All right. Everybody have a good week. Get your shots. And we'll be here next week. We'll talk about Jonah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think.
Care.
Thank you.
You're supposed to sign off.